The Alabama Territory in 1814 was a rugged and unpredictable place, a land of raw promise still carved out of wilderness. Only a year had passed since it had been separated from the Mississippi Territory, and beyond a scattering of determined settlements, the forests stretched for endless miles. The soil was rich and full of opportunity, but danger was never far away. Settlers faced disease that swept through each summer, crude trails and violent rivers that made every journey a gamble, and months of isolation from the rest of the world. Creek and Cherokee tribes still claimed most of the land, their ancestral homes steadily pressed upon by new settlers. The Creek War, part of the larger War of 1812, had erupted the year before. And though Andrew Jackson's victories were notable, violence still flared up around isolated outposts. Law was little more than local militias and appointed constables, quick to judge and limited in power. And in such a world, a man's reputation often outweighed evidence. Into this harsh frontier came the Blackwood family in the spring of 1814, choosing a remote area that would one day be Montgomery County. Abraham Blackwood, a stern man in his 40s, tall and broad, with the rigid bearing of a soldier, cast a long shadow over his family. His scarred jaw and icy blue eyes gave him a cold, dissecting stare that unsettled most who met him. His wife Martha, small and soft-spoken, lived almost invisibly in his presence. She moved with quiet efficiency, always busy with her hands, and seemed incapable of laughter or spontaneous joy. Their 3 children reflected their father's mark in different ways. Ezekiel at 23 carried Abraham's height and presence, but combined it with an eerie stillness, observing the world with an intensity that made people uneasy. Isaiah, 20, thinner and always with books in hand, was more approachable but gave those who spoke with him a sense of being quietly judged. Rebecca, the youngest at 14, was the most unsettling of all. Graceful and pale-eyed like her father, she spoke rarely, and when she did, her voice was oddly musical. Her unblinking gaze often left others shifting uncomfortably, and she seemed to shrink whenever Abraham entered a room, as if afraid to breathe in his presence. The Blackwoods claimed to hail from Virginia, though no one could confirm it, and their arrival with significant wealth immediately stirred curiosity. In a frontier community where fortunes were usually tied to land or trade, the sight of 4 wagons filled with fine furniture, books, and heavy crates marked as educational materials raised questions, especially since these crates were always unloaded under the cover of night. At the first meeting with the small township council held in the back of the general store that doubled as a town hall, Abraham Blackwood announced his plan. "We've come to establish a school," he said, with a deep, steady voice, "to bring education and civility to this frontier." The settlement's leaders exchanged thoughtful looks. Education was desperately needed. Children were taught at home, if at all, or apprenticed early, and only the wealthy could afford to send their children east. The closest school was over 70 miles away, a journey fraught with danger. James Wilson, a former officer from the Revolutionary War and the settlement's most influential man, asked what qualifications Abraham possessed. In response, Abraham produced a set of folded, yellowed papers, presenting them on the rough-hewn table. They claimed a distinguished career as an educator in Boston, at William and Mary, even Harvard. Though no one present had the means to verify such credentials, the official seals and worn parchment looked convincing. In a voice weighted with solemnity, he explained that tragedy had driven him westward, the death of his first wife, and that in Martha, his current wife, he had found new purpose to bring knowledge to a wild land. The story touched the council's need for education and softened their doubts. Wilson, however, remained cautious. Something in Blackwood's bearing, a careful control in his manner, set off instincts honed in war. Nevertheless, the town could not ignore such an opportunity. Abraham requested a building large enough for classrooms and boarding students, and the council suggested an abandoned mission 3 miles away. Built by Spanish missionaries and deserted after conflicts with native tribes. The old limestone structure still stood strong, though the roof had collapsed and weather had worn it down. Abraham inspected the site the next day, walking the grounds slowly, his attention drawn to the cellar entrance and the mission's distance from nearby farms. Pleased with its seclusion, he declared it perfect, praising the thick walls and the surrounding woods for their ability to keep distractions at bay. Within a month, the Blackwoods transformed the mission. They hired local men at unusually generous wages, paying in silver. Abraham demanded exacting standards, sometimes tearing down work that did not meet his vision. The main chapel became a classroom, the altar replaced by a teacher's desk pews, swapped for orderly rows of benches. Smaller rooms became dormitories, one for boys, one for girls, and private quarters for the family. A new roof was built, glass, imported from Mobile, replaced broken windows, and a tall fence was raised around the perimeter. When asked about the imposing barrier, Abraham replied that it was for the students' safety, citing wild animals and hostile natives. Yet, there were details that unsettled the workers. Reinforced cellar doors, heavy locks on nearly every room, and the construction of a separate building behind the main structure. Abraham called it his private study, a sanctuary for delicate scientific instruments, but its narrow, high windows looked more like those of a prison. Henry Davis, a carpenter, once asked about this, and Abraham's expression briefly hardened before he smiled and offered an explanation, a European preference that protected books from sunlight. The pay was good, so Davis let it go, though over drinks he confided to Wilson that something about Blackwood didn't sit right. Wilson balancing caution with the settlement's desperate need for a school-advised patience. By summer, the Blackwood Academy for Young Minds stood ready, and Abraham began visiting neighboring settlements to recruit students. His pitch promised a classical education, Latin, Greek, mathematics, natural philosophy, and proper etiquette training that would prepare frontier children to match those of Philadelphia or Boston. For wary fathers, he promised practical instruction, as well farming, basic engineering, and surveying. For anxious mothers, Martha would quietly add, "I treat every child as my own. Their well-being is my sacred trust." This gentle assurance, combined with Abraham's confidence, convinced many that their isolated frontier had found its gateway to refinement. Frontier families welcomed the idea of the Blackwood Academy with open arms. For parents who had come west to escape poverty and hardship, a school promising refinement and opportunity for their children was a dream realized. By September 23, students were enrolled ages 8 to 16, with 15 living at the academy and the rest traveling daily from nearby farms. Tuition was steep, $5 per month for day students and $12 for boarders. But Abraham softened his image by granting scholarships to 2 gifted children from poor families. The school's opening ceremony was a proud occasion. Parents arrived on horseback or by wagon, their children dressed in their best clothes, carrying small trunks of belongings. Abraham greeted fathers with a firm handshake, while Martha offered mothers a restrained, brittle smile. Ezekiel and Isaiah stood at their father's side like soldiers, and Rebecca silently guided students to their quarters. From the mission steps, Abraham told the assembled parents, "Your children will emerge transformed. You may not even recognize them when they return." The words were met with enthusiastic applause, though no one noticed the faint knowing glance between Abraham and his eldest son, or the way Martha's fingers trembled as she clasped them together. As the wagons rolled away, Sarah Winters looked back at her 10-year-old son Timothy, who seemed so small against the towering stone walls. Something in her heart whispered to turn around, but James urged the horses forward. "Blackwood knows what he's doing," he reassured her. "This is a grand opportunity." The first week seemed to confirm that belief. Day students returned home speaking of strict rules, but fascinating lessons. Abraham grouped students by age and skill rather than by gender. Isaiah taught the youngest to read and count, while Abraham himself took charge of advanced subjects, impressing them with knowledge of Latin, Greek navigation, and astronomy. "He says I have a good mind for figures," Timothy told his father, his eyes bright with excitement. Yet even in those early days, shadows began to form. Martha was almost invisible during school hours, rarely seen beyond her household chores. Rebecca, barely 14, taught the smallest children with unnerving precision, while Ezekiel had no teaching role at all. Instead, he watched. From doorways, the bell tower, or the courtyard, he observed the students with a leather notebook in hand, writing notes as though they were specimens in a study. Within weeks, unsettling incidents surfaced. Day students whispered about strange noises from the cellar, moaning and scraping sounds Abraham dismissed as wind in the old mission walls. Children who stumbled in their lessons were escorted away by Ezekiel, sometimes for hours, and returned pale and subdued. Timothy told his mother about the meditation room, a place where Samuel, a classmate who forgot his Latin declensions, was kept for an entire day. When he came back, he wouldn't talk. Timothy whispered as she tucked him in, and he had strange marks on his wrists. Sarah brushed off these worries as childish imagination. Discipline was harsh everywhere in 1814, and Abraham, a man of learning from the East, surely knew best. But her confidence faltered when Timothy came home with bruised knuckles and refused to explain. "The boy needs discipline," James insisted. "Blackwood is making a man out of him." "There's discipline," Sarah countered, "and then there's cruelty. Timothy isn't sleeping. He has nightmares." James only scoffed. Timothy kept his silence, bound by an oath all students had been made to swear, and could not tell her what happened in that so-called meditation room, a small windowless cell beneath the chapel, pitch black, where misbehaving students were left for hours or days with nothing but bread and water. From there, they heard sounds echoing from deeper in the cellar, noises Abraham described as part of scientific research, but that haunted their dreams. By October, the boarding students were allowed home for their promised monthly visit. The change in them was obvious. They were quieter, obedient to the point of being mechanical, their answers rehearsed. "We learn our lessons. The food is adequate. Yes, we are treated well," they would say. Parents noticed scars, thin welts on the backs of their legs, circular burns on their palms. When asked about them, the children gave flimsy explanations or claimed not to remember. Mary Collins, mother of 13-year-old Emma, saw something even worse. The spark in her daughter's eyes was gone, as though the very life had been drained from her. The girl who had once been full of curiosity and laughter now sat silent at the dinner table, her eyes fixed on her plate, eating with a slow, mechanical rhythm. That night, as Mary Collins brushed her daughter's hair, she noticed how Emma winced even at the gentlest touch. "Are you happy at the school, Emma?" she asked softly. The girl hesitated, as if the answer had to be carefully selected from a list of approved phrases. "Happiness is not the purpose of education. Mr. Blackwood says we must put aside our personal desires to achieve true intellectual growth." The formality of her voice startled Mary, so unlike her child. After a long pause, she asked, "Has anyone hurt you?" "Emma." Emma's eyes darted to the window before she replied, "No, Mother. Mr. Blackwood says pain is only a sensation, something we must overcome through discipline." Troubled Mary confided in her husband that evening. But like James Winters, he refused to interfere. "Blackwood knows his business," he said. "We've paid for the term. Emma's always been sensitive. She'll adapt." Meanwhile, Martha Blackwood began appearing in town, now and then, always accompanied by Rebecca, her thin, hollow-eyed daughter. Shopkeepers noticed their purchases included strange quantities of laudanum, rare herbs, chemicals, and sacks of salt. "It's for experiments," Rebecca said in a flat voice, when asked, adding that her father believed in practical education in the natural sciences. These purchases alarmed Daniel Edwards, the town apothecary, enough that he mentioned them to James Wilson, pointing out that laudanum was a strong opiate, and some of the chemicals were dangerous even for adults. Wilson, already wary of Abraham Blackwood, resolved to bring up the matter during his planned visit to the academy later that month. That visit never came. 2 days before he was to arrive, Emma Collins vanished. Abraham himself came to the Collins farm, wearing a look of practiced sympathy. "She ran away during the night," he told them. "She took nothing with her. We've searched the surrounding woods, but found no trace. I fear she may have fallen victim to wild animals or hostile natives." Thomas Collins was unconvinced. Emma wouldn't run away. She's dreamed of school her whole life. She wouldn't just leave. Abraham's expression grew firm. "With all due respect, Mr. Collins, you haven't seen her daily." She struggled. Only yesterday she broke down in tears when asked to recite her geometry theorems. Isaiah had to remove her from the room. Mary felt a cold weight settle in her chest as she remembered how subdued Emma had been during her visit home. "She never said a word about that," she whispered. "Children often hide their failings," Abraham said smoothly. "They dread disappointing their parents." The Collins family demanded a search, and neighbors quickly organized parties to comb the forest. For days they scoured the dense, rain-soaked wilderness, but the land swallowed all signs of Emma. With no tracks to follow and the autumn storms washing away what little evidence there might have been, the trail went cold. Constable George Taylor, a former militiaman with little training but a strong sense of duty, requested permission to inspect the academy. Abraham agreed without hesitation. "I doubt you'll find anything we haven't already." "But of course," he said. The tour revealed nothing that an untrained eye would question. The classrooms were orderly, the students silent and attentive as Isaiah Blackwood taught switch in hand. The dormitories were bare but adequate with straw beds and simple wooden trunks. The kitchen was well stocked and tidy. In the cellar, Abraham showed Taylor a large storage room lined with shelves. "Food, firewood, and educational materials," he explained. Taylor did not notice the section of freshly disturbed earth concealed behind barrels, nor the small locked door hidden behind a cabinet that led to a deeper level beneath the school. He missed, too, the faint stains on the floor of the correction room, almost scrubbed away, but still visible between the cracks in the stones. And he failed to question why the heavy door to that room locked from the outside, or why iron rings had been fixed into its walls. Satisfied, Taylor returned to report to the Collins family and to James Wilson. "The school is strict, but it seems well run," he said. "The children look healthy enough, though quiet." Thomas Collins refused to believe it. Emma wouldn't run. Something happened to her, he insisted. Wilson placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll keep searching, Thomas. Perhaps she's trying to find her way to relatives." "She barely knows her aunt in Georgia," Thomas said. "A 13-year-old wouldn't cross hundreds of miles alone. She's either out there in the woods or she's still in that school and Blackwood's lying." Wilson sighed. "Without evidence, we can't accuse him. It would destroy the academy. But I'll be watching closely." They searched for weeks, but Emma was never found, and she would not be the last. By December, 2 more boarding students had vanished from the Blackwood Academy. The first was 12-year-old Samuel Jenkins, son of a blacksmith from a settlement 20 miles away. His father had stretched their means to afford tuition, believing the school could open a better future for his only son. Samuel disappeared in mid-November, just 2 weeks after Emma. Once again, Abraham claimed the boy had run away, insisting he left during the night with food and a blanket. This time, the excuse seemed even less believable. A blizzard had struck the region that night. When Samuel's father arrived at the academy, frozen and furious, Abraham calmly insisted the storm began after Samuel had already gone. "I fear he was planning his escape for some time," he said smoothly. Soon after, 15-year-old Eliza Thompson vanished. Unlike Samuel, she had excelled at the academy, showing a particular gift for mathematics. Abraham produced a note supposedly written by her, saying she could no longer bear the strict discipline and intended to find her own way in the world. Her parents, who had traveled 3 days to reach the school, thought the handwriting seemed oddly strained. But Abraham's demeanor left little room for argument. Once again, there was no trace of the missing student despite exhaustive searches. 3 disappearances in less than 2 months began to stir fear throughout the settlement. Some families withdrew their children, unwilling to risk another loss. Among those who remained, Timothy Winters developed a strange illness that seemed to strike only on school days. Eventually, after finding him trying to flee into the woods rather than return to class, his mother, Sarah, refused to send him back. One night while James slept, she sat on the edge of Timothy's bed and asked him to tell her the truth about what happened at the academy. At first, he shook his head, terrified. "I can't," he whispered. "They made us swear an oath. They said they'd know if we told, and they'd find us." Sarah begged him to explain, and finally the words spilled out. "The Blackwoods see everything," he whispered. "They have ways of knowing. Mr. Blackwood says he can read our thoughts even from far away. And Ezekiel follows children into the woods. I saw him. He began to rock, hugging his knees. There are lessons, and then there are other lessons. The ones in the cellar. Mr. Blackwood says he's teaching us about the true nature of existence. He uses the weak ones to teach the rest of us. The ones who cry, who try to run, who don't obey, first they go to the correction room. Then, if they don't change, they go to the cellar for special lessons. And then, his voice cracked. Then they run away. That's what he tells us. But they don't run away, Ma. I heard Emma screaming even after Mr. Blackwood said she was gone. Horrified, Sarah gathered him close, promising he would never go back. That same night, she told James everything. He wanted to dismiss it as childish imagination. But her insistence and Timothy's terror forced him to agree their son would not return. "We'll say he's needed on the farm," James decided. The next day, Sarah began speaking with other parents of day students. The stories were the same children who were terrified to return, children with strange marks or bruises, children who woke screaming at night. Though few could describe the punishments in detail, they all shared a dread of the academy. The worried parents took their concerns to the township council. Some dismissed the complaints as resistance to strict education, but others began to see a pattern they could no longer ignore. James Wilson, who had once been a strong supporter of the Blackwoods, could no longer deny the troubling signs, the vanishings, the children's behavior, the strange chemicals Martha purchased in town. "Something is wrong at that school," he told Constable George Taylor and a small group of fathers in a private meeting. "But we need proof." It was then that a solution presented itself. In early January 1815, a young doctor named Jonathan Hayes stopped at the settlement tavern on his way west to set up a medical practice. At 28, trained in Philadelphia, he had intelligence education and an outsider's perspective. Wilson approached him over dinner and explained their concerns. "We need someone with a careful eye to observe the academy from the inside," he said. "Someone who might see what our constable missed. Blackwood won't suspect you." Hayes listened intently, his sense of justice stirred by the thought of children in danger. "What exactly do you believe is happening?" he asked. "We don't know," Wilson admitted. "But 3 children have vanished, all supposedly running away in bad weather. There are strange sounds, strange purchases, and children who seem terrified. We need answers." Hayes thought for a moment, then said I could present myself as a potential investor. "Someone interested in opening a similar school elsewhere." Wilson nodded. "Exactly. Blackwood is always seeking funding. He won't turn you away." And with that, the plan was set. Hayes postponed his journey for a week, taking on the role of an interested investor to gain entry into the Blackwood Academy. The Township Council supplied him with a letter of introduction, naming him a representative of Eastern patrons eager to fund frontier education. Presenting the letter with calm assurance, Hayes met with Abraham Blackwood the next day. Abraham, always ready to attract more money, received him warmly and invited him to stay at the school to witness their methods firsthand. "It will be my honor to show you what can be accomplished even here, in these primitive conditions," Abraham said as he led him through the main classroom, where rows of silent children recited Latin under Isaiah's watch. "With further funding, I could expand our curriculum and perhaps establish schools across the territory." Hayes noted how the children's eyes followed Abraham blank, detached, drained of emotion. When one boy stumbled over a recitation, the color drained from his face at Abraham's approach, though Abraham corrected him with a smooth, chilling smile. "Your students are remarkably disciplined," Hayes commented. "Discipline is the foundation of learning," Abraham replied with pride. "These frontier children arrive like rough stones. My task is to cut away the flaws and polish them until they shine with the light of reason." The word struck Hayes as cold and dehumanizing, but he concealed his reaction, letting Abraham talk of how the weak reveal themselves and how most adapt, though some cannot endure true education. Abraham gave him a tour of the facilities, including the correction room, which he described as a place for reflection and improvement. But when Hayes asked about the cellar, Abraham dismissed it. Merely storage. Nothing of interest for a man of your intellect. For 3 days, Hayes observed classes, meals, and evening routines. Outwardly, the school was orderly, but beneath its surface, something was deeply wrong. The children moved like automatons, silent, even during meals, their eyes lifeless. They flinched at every Blackwood who passed. After nightfall, Hayes saw the family dynamic more clearly. Martha silent, Rebecca ghost-like, Isaiah precise and deferential, and Ezekiel always watching, especially the girls. Hayes also noticed moments when Abraham's polished demeanor dropped away, revealing the cruelty beneath. One afternoon, unseen in a hallway, he glimpsed Abraham in the correction room, pressing a heated rod to a boy's arm. The child didn't even scream, staring straight ahead, with an expression so empty it made Hayes shudder. Each night after the children were locked away, muffled cries echoed faintly from beneath the floor. On the 3rd night, Hayes traced those cries to a concealed door hidden behind pantry shelves. Slipping through when no one was around, he found stairs hacked into the earth, lit faintly by a lantern below. The deeper he descended, the colder the air became heavy, with the metallic tang of blood, and something more sinister that his medical training could identify only as suffering. At the bottom, he entered a network of crude earthen chambers. Chains hung from the walls, and in 3 of the cells he saw emaciated children covered in scars and burns, their bodies marked by long, deliberate torture. One girl was unmistakably Emma Collins. Though barely recognizable from the portrait her parents had shown her, features and dark hair confirmed her identity. Her eyes opened when Hayes approached, but there was no shock or hope, only a blank acceptance. "Are you here for the lesson?" she whispered, her voice brittle. "What lesson?" Hayes asked. "Father Blackwood's lesson about pain and transcendence," she murmured. "He says some of us must be vessels so others can learn through us." Fighting a wave of nausea, Hayes promised to get her out. He inspected the chains, realizing he would need tools or a key. Before he could act, footsteps echoed on the stairs. Hayes melted into the shadows as Ezekiel descended, carrying a tray of small gleaming instruments, knives, pincers, tools designed for slow agony. "Time for tonight's lesson," Ezekiel said gently, approaching Emma's cell. "Father says your resistance is almost gone. Soon you'll join the others." "Yes, Brother Ezekiel," she replied tonelessly. "I am learning to transcend." Ezekiel smiled. "Good. Tonight we will study how pain leads to spiritual elevation. Father says you are progressing even faster than Samuel did." Hidden Hayes forced himself to stay silent, knowing he would be overpowered if he moved. For now he had only one choice: escape and bring help. Hayes slipped out of the lower cellar while Ezekiel prepared his instruments silently, retracing his steps up the rough earthen stairs through the pantry and back to his assigned room. Every step felt unreal. The runaways weren't runaways at all. They were captives, tortured under the guise of learning. Whether the Blackwoods acted from cruelty or from some twisted belief in transcendence, Hayes knew one thing: he had to warn the settlement. With a snowstorm raging outside and the school 3 miles from town, escape was perilous. For hours he documented everything in his journal so that if he failed, the truth might still be known. Just after midnight, he heard footsteps outside his door. The handle rattled. When he tried it, the door was locked. From his window, Hayes saw lanterns bobbing toward the outbuilding behind the main school. Abraham and his sons carrying a canvas-wrapped bundle that sagged heavily. It didn't move. Realizing he could not wait for daylight, Hayes used the small medical tools he carried to pick the simple lock, an old skill from his training in Philadelphia. Slipping out through a side door into the howling storm, he chose not to wake the students, fearing commotion would alert the Blackwoods. Snow hid the path and the freezing wind cut through his coat. Twice he fell into hidden ditches. His extremities went numb, his thoughts dull. Hours later, barely conscious, he stumbled into James Wilson's house and collapsed, gasping. Children in the cellar. At least one is dead. Wilson dragged him inside, wrapped him in blankets, and forced hot tea into his hands until he could speak. Hayes described everything: the cells, the torture, the bundle carried to the private study. "We must act before they destroy the evidence," he insisted. Before dawn, Wilson had gathered 20 armed men, most of them fathers. At the tavern, he addressed them grimly. "This is about rescue, not revenge. If the doctor is right, some of our children are still alive. We bring them home first, and then we deal with the Blackwoods." The men moved out through the dying storm. The school seemed quiet, smoke curling from its chimneys. Martha opened the door, calm and soft-spoken as ever. "My husband is teaching?" she said, startled by the sight of rifles. They pushed past her. In the main classroom, Abraham stood indignant, while rows of blank-eyed children sat perfectly still. "We have reason to believe you're keeping children prisoner," Wilson told him. Abraham laughed coldly. "This is absurd. You see, the children are safe. Your doctor has been drinking." Constable Taylor stepped forward. "Then you won't mind a search." "I do mind," Abraham snapped. "This is a school, not a criminal den." "Search everything," Wilson ordered. 2 men restrained Abraham as the rest fanned out. The students watched without a flicker of emotion. One boy rocked slightly in place, staring at the floor. The search revealed what Hayes had seen: a hidden door leading to a lower cellar. Chains bolted to walls, dark stains on the floor, the air reeking of blood and filth. But the cells were empty. Only a single small shoe remained, which Thomas Collins identified as Emma's. "Where are they?" Wilson demanded, pressing a pistol to Abraham's head. Abraham's calm broke at last, replaced by a chilling smile. "Gone," he whispered. "Beyond your reach, transcended. The vessel is only the beginning." Hayes stopped Wilson's finger from tightening on the trigger. "Alive, he might lead us to them," the doctor said. The search widened to the outbuilding Abraham called his study. A heavy lock barred the door. When they smashed it open, a wave of stench rolled out so strong it made hardened farmers stagger back. Inside, they found a room that was part laboratory, part shrine to madness. Jars lined the walls, each holding unrecognizable tissue, carefully labeled with phrases like Subject 7, Resistance Point, and Subject 12, Transcendence Threshold. A long table with restraint stained dark stood in the center. Instruments lay neatly arranged beside it. There were notebooks filled with precise records of experiments, how children responded to pain, isolation, and fear. In one corner stood something older and darker: ritual tools, symbols carved into the floor, and an altar stained deep with something that was no longer just blood. Around it stood candles made from some strange wax, and on the altar lay a book bound in what looked like human skin, filled with strange symbols in a language no one could read. "Dear God," whispered Reverend Johnson, "this isn't madness, it's evil." But of the Blackwoods, there was no sign. They had vanished, horses gone from the stables. The men gathered the remaining students, who seemed dazed, speaking only when prompted and giving mechanical answers. Dr. Hayes examined them. Needle marks on their arms, small burns and cuts, scars from restraints. "They've been drugged," he explained, voice grim. "Not just broken in body, but in mind. Those who vanished were the ones who resisted." The horror was now undeniable. The school was empty of its captors, but its damage would linger for years. Even as the rescuers led the surviving children away from the academy, many continued to recite their lessons, unable to grasp that they were safe. When asked if she understood she was being taken home, one girl murmured, "Father says we must continue our studies." The weak fall away, but the strong transcend. Hayes warned the gathered parents that their children had been systematically drugged and broken. Some, he said, might never fully recover. A manhunt for the Blackwoods spread across the territory. Riders carried descriptions of the family to neighboring settlements and states. Abraham tall and cold-eyed, Martha silent and watchful, Ezekiel predatory, Isaiah the scholarly middle son, and Rebecca thin, nervous, and hollow-eyed. But the winter frontier was vast, and the family had vanished into it. Searchers followed trails to abandoned cabins, always a few steps behind. In the abandoned school, the townspeople found more horror. 3 small graves lay hidden beneath a root cellar. The remains too decayed for identification, though a ribbon, a knife, and a carved toy horse confirmed they belonged to children who had run away months earlier. The surviving students slowly regained their health, but many never recovered their former selves. Some spoke of grotesque lessons in the cellar, where Abraham taught anatomy by demonstration, while others recalled ceremonies in the outbuilding where he muttered in strange languages and promised a transformation to come. Timothy Winters spared the worst by feigning illness. Explained Mr. Blackwood said he was preparing vessels. Some children were special, he said, able to hold more of something he called the essence. The rest of us were practice. When Hayes asked what this essence was, Timothy said only, "He told us it was ancient, older than people. It needs bodies to work in our world." Other students confirmed pieces of this story. Hayes's meticulous journal became the first detailed record of systematic child abuse disguised as education. Published later in the East, his account was dismissed by some as superstition, but it endured as a chilling warning. 2 months after the family vanished, word came from Mississippi Territory. A family calling themselves the Whitefords had opened a school. By the time authorities arrived, the building was empty. All that remained were reinforced cellars with clawed walls. For years, similar reports surfaced in Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky. Each time they took on a new name, operated until suspicions grew, then disappeared before anyone could stop them. In some places, they refined their methods, offering private tutoring instead of formal schools targeting gifted or sensitive children. The last confirmed sighting came in 1820 when a hunter stumbled upon a cabin in the Alabama woods. Through the window, he saw an older Abraham with 2 younger men bending over a table where a young girl was restrained. Believing it was a medical procedure, he left. But after hearing tales of the educator devils, he returned with others. The cabin was empty. Freshly disturbed soil inside revealed human remains and a single small shoe. The girl was never identified. What followed was speculation and fear. Historians estimate that the Blackwood's confirmed victims numbered at least 15. But many suspect there were dozens more across the frontier. The journals left behind hinted at motivations that combined science and something older, darker. Abraham wrote of testing human limits, stripping away morality, and preparing vessels for something ancient. His notes described etheric detachment and separating consciousness from the vessel. And he referred to classrooms as his hunting ground, a place to identify exceptional children to become perfect vessels. One particularly chilling entry written shortly before their discovery stated, "The transformation is nearly complete in subjects 3, 7, and 12. They no longer resist. They no longer see themselves as separate from the experiment. Soon they will be ready for the final phase. The family grows." Decades later, in 1842, Missouri authorities investigated a remote orphanage run by the Harrison family. The Harrisons escaped, but investigators found a chained young woman who claimed she was Emma Collins, missing since 1814. She told a confused story about Father Abraham remaking her and how she had helped educate other children. Her body bore scars of decades-long abuse, and she died soon after her rescue. If she was indeed Emma, it proved the Blackwoods had succeeded in creating loyal followers. The mission school was burned to the ground, its ashes salted, so nothing would grow. Locals claimed for decades afterward that no birds sang there, no animals stayed long, and sometimes at dusk, they heard the faint sound of children's voices calling from the trees. Even years later, their legacy cast a shadow across the frontier. Before his execution, the man calling himself John Smith revealed his true identity as Isaiah Blackwood. According to prison records, his last words were chilling. "The family endures." The work continues. Father would be proud. Authorities discovered that for years, Isaiah had been running a small school for gifted children in a poor district of New Orleans. Beneath the floorboards of his home, they found the bodies of 3 children, their remains showing the same patterns of prolonged captivity and experimentation that had once been uncovered at the original Blackwood Academy. Further investigation revealed that Isaiah had been communicating in code with contacts across at least 6 states. Though the cipher was never fully cracked, fragments pointed to a network of like-minded individuals carrying on Abraham's twisted vision, exchanging methods, and selecting promising children for their so-called work. The legacy of the Blackwood Academy became a grim warning about the dangers facing isolated frontier communities in their desperation to bring education and culture to remote settlements. Families sometimes opened their doors to predators who hid behind respectability. Abraham's polished manners and claimed academic credentials, real or forged, gave him access to victims and shielded him from suspicion for years. His role as an educator, a figure rarely questioned, gave him total control over his students. It is a pattern that is repeated throughout history. Respected institutions, shielding predatory figures from scrutiny. Modern experts who have studied the Blackwood case recognize the deliberate techniques of coercive control. The Blackwoods isolated their students, stripped away their identities with unpredictable punishment and reward, created dependency, and replaced family ties with a rigid, warped belief system. Their methods, described in the recovered journals, are now seen as an early documented form of systematic brainwashing. Dr. Eleanor Harrington, a historian of 19th century American education, has described the Blackwoods as the ultimate dark reflection of a period that prized obedience and discipline above all else. The Alabama frontier of 1814 offered a new beginning to many, but for the Blackwoods, it was a hunting ground. Hidden from scrutiny, they pursued their own vision of civilizing the wilderness, which for them meant exploiting and reshaping young minds and bodies. Research into their origins has never revealed a trace of Abraham Blackwood's academic past. Historians speculate that the family may have come from Europe, possibly influenced by early experiments in psychiatry, or by secretive sects that mixed Enlightenment rationalism with occult practices. Symbols found carved into the floors of the Blackwood study have been linked to esoteric traditions that spoke of the body as a vessel for transformation. Twisted beyond recognition, these ideas became the foundation for their cruelty. Over time, the story of the Blackwoods became a part of American folklore, inspiring novels, plays, and films that often depict them as supernatural. These fictions, while sensational, distract from a far darker truth. The Blackwoods were not otherworldly monsters, but human beings who chose to inflict systematic suffering on children. The survivors carried the weight of that suffering for the rest of their lives. Timothy Winters, one of the lucky few, grew up to become a physician, inspired by the kindness of Dr. Hayes and driven to oppose the harm he had seen. In his 1860 memoir, he wrote, "I chose to heal because I had seen what deliberate harm looks like. My life became a counterweight to that darkness. Many others never recovered. Some numbed themselves with alcohol or laudanum. Some ended their lives leaving notes that referred to finally escaping Father Blackwood's lessons. Their pain is a reminder that the scars inflicted by psychological control can last far beyond the physical. The question that lingers is how many others like the Blackwoods have operated unseen in the shadowed corners of history, their crimes written off as accidents of the wilderness. The mission school that once promised enlightenment became a prison where innocence was dismantled piece by piece. And while the original academy was burned and the land salted, the echoes of those horrors persist. To this day, travelers through the forests of central Alabama speak of strange clearings where nothing grows, of nights where the woods go silent, and of faint voices whispering lessons long after the buildings have crumbled. The Blackwoods may be gone, but their legacy of cruelty and manipulation remains a cautionary tale that reminds us that evil often wears the mask of civility. In the end, the wilderness the settlers feared most was not in the forests around them, but in the hearts of those who stood at the front of the classroom. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to continue joining us on our journey into the darkest corners of history. And remember, evil rarely calls itself by its real name. Good night, if you can.